All right. This hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on U.S. policy priorities in the Middle East. I thank our witnesses for appearing today, and I will start by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Thanks to our panel. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for the work you do for our nation. At the outset of the 116th Congress and 2 years into the Trump administration, the United States faces a multitude of challenges in the Middle East. We just marked the 8th anniversary of the start of the war in Syria, which has led to the deaths of more than 500,000 people, the displacement of millions both inside Syria and in neighboring countries. The conflict and the humanitarian crisis that it created has the potential to reshape the region literally for decades to come. Iran continues to support Bashar al-Assad and carry out its destabilizing activities in countries from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq. Outside powers, such as Russia, use military force, economic support, and weapon sales to increase their regional influence at the expense of the United States. Libya is fractured. Yemen is ravaged by civil war, the intervention of regional states, and the world's worst humanitarian crisis. While these issues receive the bulk of the headlines and media attention, other events and trends also deserve our focus. Tunisia's nascent democracy confronts serious economic and political challenges. Algeria's president submitted his resignation yesterday after 2 decades in power. The dispute splitting the Gulf Cooperation Council is at a stalemate, and Israel has threats on its borders and peace that is still elusive. A youth bulge, approximately 45% of the Middle East is under 25 years old, presents a myriad of challenges and opportunities in the coming decade. And more than 8 years after millions took to the streets around the region in protest of corruption and autocracy, too many regional governments remain unaccountable to their people and opposed to democracy, an open civil society, and human rights. In the wake of these challenges, the United States requires a well-formulated, clear-eyed approach to the Middle East. Unfortunately, the administration's policy toward the region is confusing and, at some points, seemingly incoherent. The President announced the rapid and complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria in December with little notice given to international allies and partners on the ground. This decision prompted the resignation of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and Special Envoy to defeat ISIS Brett McGurk, yet the administration now plans to keep anywhere from 400 to 1,000 troops in Syria, a number that changes in the press almost by the day, and U.S. long-term strategy in Syria remains elusive and ambiguous. In Yemen, the Trump administration has offered unstinting support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and while I recognize, understand the risk posed by the Houthis and Iranian forces in Yemen, the conflict has led to tens of thousands of civilian casualties. It's shifted focus from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and has worsened this horrific humanitarian crisis and catastrophe. Furthermore, the Trump administration has offered an inconsistent message on human rights and democratic values at a time when many are questioning the American commitment to the region. The administration has too often turned a blind eye to human rights abuses and has equivocated in expressing support for democratic development in the Middle East. I believe our relationships with regional states are vital to our national security and to geopolitical stability. These are ties that are enduring and many date to the end of the Second World War. However, we should view our relationship with regional states through the prism of our own interests and values. Where do our priorities align? What type of actions undermine our goals and undermine U.S. values? We should be honest in reassessing where our interests and values diverge, in identifying actions that set back our mutual objectives, and in expressing our opposition when our allies and partners do not live up to those standards. Furthermore, while the Trump administration often articulates maximalist goals in the Middle East, it has cut the resources needed to achieve them. For the 3rd straight year, the Trump administration has proposed drastic cuts to our foreign affairs budget. The FY20 Trump budget request includes a 6% drop in funding for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs compared to FY19. This subcommittee has oversight responsibility over the NEA budget. And I hope this hearing can help us better grasp the trends, the challenges, and opportunities facing the United States in the Middle East, and help us better execute our oversight responsibility. I also hope the witnesses will provide an honest assessment of recent U.S. policy and how the United States government, specifically Congress, can take steps to foster a more successful approach to the region that secures our national interests without sacrificing the values that make us unique and admired around the world. I thank the witnesses for appearing, and I now turn to Ranking Member Wilson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. The complexities of the Middle East pose enduring challenges to U.S. interest in the region and have vexed both Republican and Democratic administrations alike. It's certainly not a region for the faint of heart. Just a cursory glance at the Middle East can be overwhelming. At the same time, I'm grateful that the Trump administration has been achieving some important successes in such a complicated environment. The Trump administration has presided over the defeat of ISIS' so-called caliphate. This certainly does not mean the threat from ISIS has been neutralized, but seizing ISIS's territory denies the terrorist group both a lucrative profit stream as well as a safe haven from which to orchestrate attacks against the U.S. and our allies. There is no doubt that this is a major achievement that has made our country and the world safer. President Trump rightfully withdrew from the flawed Iran nuclear agreement. The Trump administration has increased the pressure on Tehran in response to its reckless development of ballistic missiles and continued sponsorship of global terrorism. The pressure on Iran has yielded concrete dividends. U.S. sanctions have prevented Iran from delivering any oil to its Syrian client, the Assad regime, since January 2nd. In the last 3 months of 2018, Iran was sending 66,000 barrels a day to Syria. The Syrian people will never forget that it was the Trump administration that finally enforced the previous administration's red line, striking Assad twice for using of chemical weapons against civilians. Sanctions on Iran have also affected Tehran's sponsorship of regional terrorism. Just last week, reports indicated that Iran had to slash payments to fighters in Syria by a third due to the pain of the American sanctions. Even employees of Hezbollah have missed paycheck and lost perks. The administration has also made the bold move of designated major Iranian-backed militias for terrorism, including the Nujaba in Iraq and the brigades of Afghan and Pakistani mercenaries Iran has been exploited as cheap fodder in Syria's bloody civil war. Under the leadership of President Trump, the dynamics of the Middle East appear to be shifting. His first international trip was to Riyadh, where Gulf Cooperation Council countries, along with other Muslim countries, publicly agreed on the need to counter extremism. The journey is far from complete, but this step was unprecedented and positive. In February, the administration convened a conference in Warsaw, bringing Arab countries and Israel together to confront the Iranian regional threat. Notably, this came after the Trump administration's relocation of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, a move that many incorrectly predicted would upend ties between the Jewish state and its Arab neighbors. The Trump administration must continue to build on these achievements. Like Chairman Deutsch, I too was concerned by the August 2018 decision to freeze U.S. stabilization funding to Syria and the 2018 decision to withdraw troops from the country. There is simply no substitute for U.S. leadership in the Middle East, especially given that Russia and Iran are more than happy to fill the void. The administration must also continue going after the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Some of these militias won seats in Iraq's parliamentary elections in May and stand to receive U.S. taxpayer money sent to the Iraqi government. These groups include those with American blood on their hands, such as the AAH and the Badr organization. It's time to correct this long-time standing failure of U.S. policy and cut off all armed groups taking orders from the mullahs in Tehran. There is no way to simplify the thorny challenges to the U.S. policy in the Middle East. This is a region that will unfortunately continue to trouble U.S. policymakers for years to come. While we may disagree on the details, I think we can all agree on one guiding principle. U.S. leadership and engagement in the Middle East is essential. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now recognize members of the subcommittee for a 1-minute opening statement, should they wish to make one. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. As a former chair of this committee, I just want to emphasize that the importance of U.S. engagement, it's just critical. Really can't be overemphasized. And I would just note that the chair did tag this administration with their policy being, I think, confusing, incoherent were the terms that the gentleman used. And I would just make the point that I think many, including myself, believe that the previous administration's policies there were far worse. From, for example, and I happen to also chair the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee a while back, and the previous administration was bound and determined to de-emphasize our role in the Middle East, and pivot was the initial term they used to Asia. And then they later on called it a rebalance because pivot seemed a little too clear on what they were trying to do, and rebalance, for whatever reason, seemed a little more politically correct. And ultimately, it's questionable whether they did that or not. I would argue they perhaps de-emphasized both regions rather than strengthen us in either place, which was a mistake. The previous administration famously drew a red line and then ignored it, and we've seen untold deaths in Syria as a direct result of that policy. And probably the most disastrous thing the previous administration did was that after all the blood and treasure that were spent in Iraq was then to, against the advice of just about everybody, just pull all our troops out. Having been there a number of times, having talked to the troops and the leaders on the ground and our allies there, no one really anticipated that the administration would actually do that, but they did. And that left a power vacuum, which then was filled by ISIS. And we saw the horrors that occurred under the hands of ISIS. And then the administration's response to that. Yes, they ultimately did respond after they'd taken over a significant portion of the area, especially Iraq, but also Syria. And then they kind of handcuffed our troops there, and we weren't really able to respond as was necessary. The current administration took those handcuffs off, and we saw the demise of ISIS. That doesn't mean that we can ignore them. Some of them scattered into other areas, and so we have to, I think, be very aware that they could still be a threat, but compared to where they were, we're much better off. So just a few points. So we do need to continue to be engaged in the Middle East and work with our allies there. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now introduce our witnesses. First, Ms. Elisa Catalano-Ewers is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a faculty lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University of Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. For over a decade, Ms. Catalano-Ewers served in senior foreign policy and national security positions in the U.S. government, including as a director for the Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council staff and in multiple positions at the Department of State. Mr. Daniel Ben-Naim is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, researching U.S. policy in the Middle East, as well as a visiting assistant professor at New York University's Program in International Relations. He previously served as a Middle East policy advisor and foreign policy speechwriter at the White House, the Department of State, and the United States Senate. He was also an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, Ms. Danielle Pletka is Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she oversees the Institute's work on foreign and defense issues. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Ms. Pletka was a longtime senior professional staff member for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, where she specialized in Near East and South Asia, and where she also worked with our friend who's not here. So I will wait until he returns to reunite the two of you. Thanks very much to all of our witnesses. We appreciate your being here. We appreciate your taking the time to offer your insight with this committee. And Ms. Catalano-Ewers, I will recognize you first. I'll remind all of the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. And without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the hearing record. Again, thanks so much. And Ms. Catalano-Ewers, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join you here today. I'm humbled to be sitting here alongside two very respected colleagues. Nation states and institutions in the region have suffered severe blows. Some states have turned inward, like Egypt, some have disintegrated, like Syria, and others have taken on a more aggressive foreign policy, like Saudi Arabia. Non-state actors such as al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have sought to exploit these power vacuums, and multiple levels of competition are happening across the region. The perception of the last decade is a United States in withdrawal. Whether the perception is correct or not is no longer the point. This view has unsettled partners and encouraged competitors. What happens in the Middle East rarely stays there, whether in the form of clear and imminent threats, such as terrorism or proliferation, or more intractable threats, like the humanitarian crises that reverb inside and outside the region. The reality is that the United States cannot extricate itself from the region and should not try to. However, it could deploy itself smartly and more effectively. This administration inherited these systemic challenges. It also inherited strategies, some of which, like the counter-ISIS campaign, has managed to pursue with success. But such campaigns never end with battlefield wins. The administration has also relied on cults of personality rather than statecraft. It has placed a high value on individual personal relations with Egypt, Saudi, and others at the expense of institutional engagement. It has promulgated rhetoric, but also a sense of unpredictability. Some governments in the region may embrace the more aggressive posture on Iran, but the Syria withdrawal announcement, the lack of active engagement with Iraq, and the absence of the highest level of U.S. diplomatic pressure in Yemen all illustrate that there isn't a single comprehensive regional strategy on Iran. It has ignored bad actions from partners in pursuit of wins. The administration's unwillingness to press partners when they act inconsistently with U.S. interests conveys a sense that some have a blank check. Going forward, we will need to watch for the resurgence of groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, the disintegration of political processes in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, the unintended escalation and conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, or conflict in the seas around the Arabian Peninsula, humanitarian displacement and refugee crises, repression against citizens across the region, and the consequences of unanswered economic and political grievances. In light of all this complexity, I'd offer just a number of immediate steps Congress could consider. First, Congress should exercise its powers to receive a full strategy on Iran beyond just the campaign of economic pressure. Congress should act consistent with the notion that diplomacy and development are tools of first resort, continue the trend of restoring budgets to the State Department and USAID, and field qualified ambassadors and senior officials. Congress should insist that the administration pursue diplomatic ends, ways, and means, such as actively supporting political negotiations in Yemen and sustaining full partnership with Iraq. Congress should also insist that the U.S. support to partners comes with a firm commitment to hold partners accountable for their actions. This includes a full accounting into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The United States retains leverage, but it must be exercised. Congress should continue to remind partners that the United States' views on human rights violations and overall repressive policies are part of the continuum of regional instability, not separate from it. There is no shortage of bipartisan issues on which Congress can use the power of its own outreach, its pulpit, and its purse to support balanced and reasoned approaches. Whether it be support for Israel's security while also keeping the road to peace viable, or reaffirming commitments to the security of regional partners without conceding to proxy wars throughout the region. Congress can help ensure U.S. relationships are assessed honestly and in all of their complexity. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Catalano-Ewers. Mr. Benaim, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity and invitation to testify. I start from the premise that no party and no president has a monopoly on wisdom or wishful thinking, on success or failure, least of all in this region that has thwarted so many good intentions. There are no easy choices, but there are better and worse ones in my mind, and better and worse outcomes to expect as a result. The retaking of the last ISIS-held villages in Syria, a bipartisan project started by one president and finished by another, shows that U.S. leadership can still tackle major regional challenges. But other developments make clear the need for congressional oversight and tough questions in service of bringing out the best policies to serve the country's interest. That starts with making sure that ISIS can't come back, Iran can't acquire a nuclear weapon or hurt our allies, protecting our ally Israel and key partners. But I would argue that these goals can't be cleanly separated from the destabilization and radicalization due to ongoing regional conflicts and deficits outlined over the years in the Arab Human Development Reports. 2 years in, I'm worried that the current approach will leave the Middle East conflicts deeper and the region less stable, more dangerous, and more likely to require U.S. resources and attention for years to come. 2 years in, I would say the record is decidedly mixed. I think the Trump administration deserves credit for seeing through the military campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but I'm worried that they're underinvesting in the aftermath. They've sought to reorient Middle East policy around Iran, but have yet to offer a realistic path to reconcile maximalist goals and rhetoric with minimal investment beyond sanctions to create the conditions for progress. They have sought to restore regional partnerships that the chairman spoke of earlier, but they've done so too often by offering a blank check to Saudi Arabia and giving rulers impunity for abuses at home and destabilizing moves abroad. This committee has held, I thought, commendable hearings on the subject of Yemen, and I agree with the need to use legislation to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen and to send a clear signal and give leverage to people pushing for peace to turn a ceasefire into peace talks while still fighting al-Qaeda and helping Saudi Arabia defend its territory against Houthi missiles. Tools and process also matter to outcomes, and I worry also about a systematic downgrading and even dismantling of diplomacy and development, leading to uneven and overly personalized approaches that seem to be hurting what should be broad bipartisan support for key partnerships. Instead, in brief, I would enhance civilian engagement post-ISIS in Iraq and Syria. I would reset the terms for partnership and cooperation with Saudi Arabia and demand more responsible action. I would vote to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen in service of a larger peace, which is a bigger project than simply voting on U.S. support. I would demand an Iran strategy with realistic objectives, and I would protect U.S. diplomacy and development and seek to restore human rights as a U.S. policy priority. It's not easy, but it is essential to engage with not just states and rulers, but societies who will be drivers for long-term stability or instability. I thank you for having me and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Benaim. Ms. Pleke, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wilson, members of the committee, it's always an honor to testify before this committee. If I may, I'd like to suggest an amendment to the question you pose in this hearing. You ask, what are U.S. policy priorities in the Middle East? And that question really cannot be answered without asking what the United States seeks to achieve in the region. If our only interest is the immediate suppression of ISIS, our leaders should feel free to declare mission accomplished. But for those of us who recognize that ISIS is the fourth iteration of what used to be called al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that it will be back sooner or later, the truth is that our mission is far from accomplished. Indeed, it seems right to question what our mission actually is, not just in Syria, but throughout the region. The real question before us is, what is the just and lasting endgame for the United States in the Middle East? We can talk about Syria, and we will, or Iraq, or Iran, or Yemen, or Saudi Arabia in endless detail, I promise. And your members can offer more legislation, disincentivizing terrorism, incentivizing cooperation with U.S. allies, arming good guys, sanctioning bad guys. But without an end game, our policies are nothing more than this year's tactics. What should the end game be? To my mind, the right question to ask is how future presidents of the United States can avoid being drawn into Middle Eastern conflicts. The problems of the Middle East are national, they're sectarian, regional, political, and economic in nature. Some have suggested that the right thing to do is to ignore them and let the people of the region sort them out. After all, why does who governs Yemen or Syria matter in Florida or South Carolina? And the answer is, for the most part, it doesn't until it does. Because we so often wait for a problem to become a crisis, those in the Middle East who are suffering under tyranny or inequality or discrimination or privation seek solutions that do have an impact on us. Think of the people of Syria turning to ISIS, or the Shiites of Yemen turning to the Houthis, or the people of Iran turning to the Ayatollahs. Problems that were smaller and manageable become unmanageable challenges to U.S. interests and security. The region attracts Salafi jihadis, outside powers, and sundry bad actors because it is rife with opportunity. And the question before us is whether we want to continue to give them those opportunities. Every time we decide to do so, Americans are put in harm's way. Every time we decide Iran doesn't matter, or Hezbollah doesn't matter, or Shiites get what they deserve, or Saudis deserve to be threatened, or southern Yemenis don't deserve access to their nation's wealth, or Libyans are somehow ungovernable, or Muslims are uninterested in democracy, we open the door to those who offer to resolve those problems for the region. So what should our policies be? In Lebanon, we need to end the fiction that the government is independent of Hezbollah, a terrorist group. Any other nation in that situation would not be allowed to have a U.S. designated terrorist group sitting in the cabinet and itself avoid designation as a state sponsor. We need to more aggressively pinpoint Hezbollah financiers and supporters. We need to be more sure that the Lebanese armed forces has absolutely no relationship with Hezbollah. I'm certainly not sure of that. In Syria, we definitely need to support Syrian democratic forces and oppose the reinstatement of the Assad regime. We need to keep the Russians out. We need to penalize the Iranians as strongly as possible for their involvement. In Iraq, as my colleague said, we need to end the involvement of the Popular Mobilization Forces in the Iraqi government, and we need to compete with the Iranians on the ground. In Saudi, we need to demand the end to imprisonment and targeting of political dissidents and move towards a peace process in Yemen, understanding that that is a two-sided problem. We need to lean on the Iranians for perpetuating that conflict as well. We need to signal to Saudi Arabia that global arms sales are contingent on improvements in its rights and military records, but to do that, we need to work with our allies to ensure that they do not backfill where we pull out. In Yemen, we definitely need to recognize the complexity of the situation on the ground and bring both parties to the table. We also need to remember Al-Qaeda and ISIS are not defeated in Yemen. That is a battle that we need to work with our Arab allies to continue in our own national security interest. And on Iran, we need to begin to answer the questions that underpin the Trump administration's very successful sanctions campaign. What is the aim of that campaign? Is it regime change or is it something else? Those are legitimate questions to ask. Salafi jihadi groups, including ISIS and others, we need to be clear these groups remain resilient. When they leave Syria, Iraq, and I hope Yemen, they have opened beachheads in Africa and in Southeast Asia. I'm going to finish in a second, but you know, there are just so many challenges in the region. I didn't list half of them. We haven't talked about Algeria or Libya or Egypt or Israel and the Palestinians. Our priority should be getting our strategy right, rather than constantly addressing the most recent crisis. We can do a lot of good in the Middle East. It's really time we think about both the challenges and the opportunities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Pleka. Thanks to all of our witnesses for your excellent testimony. I'll begin the questions. Ms. Pleka, I'll accept your premise for the hearing. What do we seek to achieve? What is our mission? I'm going to ask those questions about Syria because that's the place where so many of these issues in the region come together. The Syria policy, and Mr. Chabot, I was referring only to the Syria policy in my opening comments, but the Syria policy I do find confusing. I know it is to many of us. The decision to pull back our military presence and declare ISIS defeated, depending upon how you characterize it, in the end of the caliphate, we all acknowledge that ISIS can come back, that there are still fighters, that they could take back territory in months. So as we make those pronouncements, aren't we turning our back on the SDF, and then are we relying on shaky talks with Turkey to prevent a military incursion? We've got the stagnant peace process that we hope results in the ejection of foreign forces, but Iran continues to cement its position in Syria, which poses a threat there and to our allies. And Ms. Pleka, you said our goal in Syria ought to be to keep the Russians out and to prevent Assad from holding power. It looks like we failed on both counts. I don't want to see the U.S. in an unending war, but our current policy seems to simply perpetuate chaos and instability. What should it look like? Ms. Pleka, to your question, what should our mission, how should we be defining our mission in Syria, since it's not clear that that has been defined, or ultimately what we're doing to accomplish that mission?
Thank you for being amenable to the question. It is the important one to ask. What we need to achieve in Syria is a lasting and secure government that rests on the authority of the Syrian people. That should be the end game in Syria. If we know what that end game is, we can begin to work towards it. I think there are ways, but I agree with you, they do involve the continued commitment of U.S. troops. You said absolutely rightly that there is a coincidence of the moral and the strategic imperative. Martin Indyk and I said the exact same thing to the Obama administration. People like you and people like me were ignored when we said that, when this problem was eminently solvable. It's much harder now, but we need to recognize that through proxies, if we continue with train and equip, if we leave troops on the ground, if we use the territory that has already been liberated, and if we are committed to the notion that Assad cannot remain, and therefore that we must work with the Syrian people to find an alternative government to which we can lend some credibility and authority, along with the currently liberated Syrian people, we will begin at that moment to understand how we can build the blocks towards that.
Thanks, Mr. Brennan. What role does, I mean, you talked about the need to focus on our values, and human rights need to be a U.S. policy priority. I agree with you. That should be the case, I would argue, through the entire region. What happens when it isn't viewed that way? How does that impact our ability to succeed in Syria or to hold our allies together as we confront Iran, for example?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think what happens when human rights are not respected is you see a growing trend of impunity, and one regime's actions embolden another, and that is certainly the case. And I think that it is a tragedy that Bashar Assad has been able to do what he's been able to do in the western half of Syria, and to see what has happened and his efforts to consolidate power in western Syria is to have regrets about that. I think from where we stand today, it seems to me that Assad is likely to remain in power in Damascus, and that no configuration of forces is well positioned to remove him in the near term. In eastern Syria, however, there is a real live dynamic process underway, and a U.S. opportunity to shape the terms of the rest of Syria over territory where the U.S. has exercised a security guarantee and had protected a group of people who have fought very ably against ISIS and are still figuring out the terms of their readmission into Syria. And I would think about how to use that leverage and that time, even having squandered some of it in already announcing a departure. I would think about how to use that to shape meaningful autonomy in eastern Syria and change western Syria as well as possible.
Thanks. Ms. Catalano, you were just a really quick answer before I turn it over to Mr. Wilson. If we leaned in more to the American value of human rights as we interacted with Saudi Arabia, would it change Saudi behavior?
I think the short answer is it doesn't matter whether it changes Saudi behavior in the near term or in the longer term. It needs to be talked about. This is part and parcel of what relationships with friends include, and that sometimes is a hard conversation. And when we don't include that in our consistent and constant engagement with Saudi Arabia, we send the signal that it's something the United States does not care about. And so to the extent that it has to be part of how we approach our engagement and our relationships, it's vital to do. I would argue it probably does, on the margins, have impact over time. as long as we look at it as a constant and strategig element of our discourse.
And I know we'll get to talk more about that. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. Ms. Pletka, last May I was grateful to lead the congressional delegation to the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. At the same time, policymakers and analysts suggested that such a move would result in major negative consequences for the region. What have been the consequences?
All of the warnings that were made about the region lighting on fire, about all of the Arabs who had moved closer to Israel in concert with Israel's efforts against Iran, actually didn't do as was predicted. There were certainly some pro forma reactions from Arab states, much stronger reactions from the Palestinians and from the Iranians, from Lebanon and from Syria. But I think that in terms of what many predicted, frankly, at a certain moment, I wasn't sure either. The reaction was very, very different than it would have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That is a remarkable change in the Middle East.
And it's great to see that Congress had authorized this back in 1994, and so it's been achieved. And Ms. Ewers and Mr. Benaim, while it's disappointing to see the electoral gains that Hezbollah and its allies made last May, and by Hezbollah's control over the health ministry in the new Lebanese government. It's clear that the U.S. strategy to counter Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon has not been as successful as it needs to be. What changes do you see need to be made to provide greater success in countering Hezbollah in Lebanon, and what role would any U.S. assistance have in the revised strategy?
Thank you, Congressman. I think part of what I will say is do no harm. How do we ensure that Hezbollah and Iran continue to use Lebanon for whatever nefarious activity you want to list, whether it be a position from which to threat Israel or to continue to foment instability in Syria? To detach entirely from our engagement from Lebanon, I believe, would be a fundamental mistake. I think it is difficult, but not impossible, to be able to find those areas, whether it be in supporting institutions that demonstrate that they are not completely owned subsidiaries of Hezbollah inside of Lebanon, and to cultivate relationships with opposition groups and political leaders inside the system. It will be a long game. It will not have results overnight, but it's one where the United States and, more importantly, its Arab partners in the region have an interest in ensuring that Lebanon is not completely ceded to Iran.
I mean, I think first and foremost, we have to support a strong Israeli military deterrent against Hezbollah. What they're able to do inside Lebanon, they've gained a great deal of power, and I think that we should strongly sanction Hezbollah, as we have, and I think that we should look for areas of the Lebanese armed forces that we can work with. But I think taking our ball and going home, what we have to do is engage and compete here, show up places, and act, because ceding the entire country to Iran and Hezbollah only puts us in a weaker position, I think, ultimately.
And I was grateful, Ms. Pletka, you actually cited the Hezbollah influence in Lebanon earlier. What is your view of how we can counter this?
I agree with my colleagues. I don't think the right thing to do is to turn around and simply give up on Lebanon, although I think Hezbollah and Iranian influence has grown very, very dramatically. We need to be a little bit more honest with ourselves about the influence that Hezbollah has inside the government and in the Lebanese armed forces and in the Lebanese banking system. Our Treasury Department has been after the central bank for some time, but not with complete success. And the reality is that for as long as we're willing to look away because we want to preserve some goodness in Lebanon that is separate from Hezbollah and Iran, the more we make excuses for certain sectors of the government that Hezbollah then uses to finance itself and to arm itself and to extend its power throughout the country. So it's a real challenge. We need to compete, and we need to use our leverage a lot more than we currently are.
And I've had the opportunity to visit Beirut and and Lebanon itself. What an extraordinary country it has been and can be in the future. And so I appreciate each of you having a positive proposal on how we can help restore what was an extraordinary country back to what it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the current administration took office in 2017, President Trump made his trip to Saudi Arabia, changed a bunch of policies. He met with the King of Bahrain, and he said that Bahrain would not have to worry anymore about strains in our relationship over human rights, resumed arms sales to that country, resumed arms sales that had been suspended to Saudi Arabia over the use of those arms in the war in Yemen. A question to any of you, what signal did that send to the region about our commitment to human rights in the post-Arab Spring Middle East?
I think that the signal that it sent was a fairly clear one of impunity, and it was the literal words that he used were, "You won't have a problem anymore." And it's striking that the hands that held that glowing orb in Riyadh went back to their own countries, and in fairly short order, in Saudi launched the Qatar blockade, a policy that has divided U.S. partners. In Bahrain, went back and arrested, I think, 300 people from the village of Isa Qasim, the major opposition leader. And in Egypt, went back and signed a restrictive civil society law that had been sitting on the president's desk for 6 months. Now, I think in these questions of how we think about U.S. influence over authoritarians in the Middle East, we have to keep two truths in mind, one of which is that each of these authoritarians is dealing with their own internal dynamic and is domestically driven in many ways. But we set the conditions externally and the dynamics in which they act. And I think when you see a set of steps like that in rapid order, what you're seeing is the effect of a green light. It's not to suggest that had we done nothing, they would have, acted differently or been much more virtuous. But I think you do see a real calculable effect of impunity there.
If I may, you certainly, I think you know full well what the signal was that was sent, and I think that the countries in the region got it as well. Unfortunately, we've been sending that signal for a long time. The reality is cutting off the Bahrainis, punishing the Saudis, was the end of the process that should have been paid attention to long ago. The Obama administration and even the Bush and previous administrations have not paid attention. There is a minority government in Bahrain. The majority Shiites are oppressed. The United States has done almost nothing to stand with them and has ceded that ground to the Iranians over decades. The fact is we have our Fifth Fleet there. The fact is that we have forces in Qatar, and this also causes us to make concessions to the kind of governance that we see that we ought to be pushing against. It's not just Donald Trump.
Oh, I would agree with you. Nothing is quite that simple. I would suggest there is a slight difference between the inconsistency of our previous approach and the tremendous consistency of our current approach. Let me ask you the follow-on question, though, because I think this is an interesting part of the dynamic. Does that signal help us or hurt us with respect to Iran? In other words, when we give the impression that we are no longer, even inconsistently, going to press the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians on human rights, torture, women, living within their constitutions, allowing public protest, et cetera, how does it affect our ability to reach out to the Iranian people and to promote, whether you want to call it reform, regime change, or respect for human rights, the kind of change that we all want to see in that country?
I'm happy to start. I think it's demoralizing to populations who are looking for signals from the international community, not just from the United States, but more broadly, that acknowledge their legitimate grievances. And so for a population like that of Iran, it simply underscores what the United States is not willing to engage on, and that is the well-being of the people. I would also add to that it continues to assist the regime in Iran to do what it does best, which is exploit grievances, not just inside of Iran, but outside of it, right? So when you look at Yemen, when you look at Bahrain, when you look at Iraq, when you look at Syria, the lack of consistency in the way the United States talks about the values of human rights allows those communities that are disenfranchised to become much more exploitable by Iran relatively cheaply and with little effort.
Yeah. I think it also undercuts the message that's supposedly being sent to the Iranian people that we care about their human rights and their well-being. It sometimes seems as though human rights are a weapon that you use against your enemy in the way that they're applied, rather than something that we should support to make our partners stronger and more durable and viable over time. So I think there's that as well. And the nature of Iranian influence, the reason that it has grown, is their ability to exploit these kinds of rifts, fault lines, societal grievances, to make proxies out of minorities within countries or even majorities that have not been treated well. So I think even just on the basic idea of containing Iran, a policy that abjures human rights, we should be clear that it does earn goodwill from leaders. Leaders appreciate not having to answer these questions, and that's exactly why we should ask them.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Zeldin, you recognize.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and I guess kind of building off of this exchange that was just happening, but taking in a couple of other directions. I was critical of the entry into the Iran nuclear deal. There might be a diversity of opinion amongst today's speakers. Thank you to today's witnesses for being here. At the time, I was outspoken about the need to tackle Iran's other non-nuclear bad activities because the leverage that brought the Iranians to the table, they wanted the sanctions relief. When we negotiated away the sanctions relief and entering the Iran nuclear deal, there was a lot that we weren't negotiating. But before I get to a couple of the human rights issues, I just wanted to ask a question, and this applies regardless of whether you are the strongest supporter of the Iran nuclear deal or the biggest critic of the Iran nuclear deal. Regardless, there's still an issue with respect to the sunset provisions, with the verification regime, and the non-nuclear bad activities. But specifically with regard to the first two, anything that the witnesses can add, whether you support the deal or not, there's an issue with regards to sunset provisions and the verification regime. Path forward for U.S. foreign policy.
I think you negotiate the best deal that you can get, and whether you oppose it or not, there were indeed provisions that over time would allow the Iranians very slowly to begin enriching again. There are some provisions of the deal that extend permanently, and the fact is that the visibility and verification under the deal was far greater than under any other equivalent agreement, and would continue indefinitely. These are unsatisfying answers to many, I realize.
Yeah, in all fairness, I mean, with all due respect, I, as a member of Congress, I haven't read the verification. The side deal that was entered into between IAEA and Iran hasn't even been provided to Congress. When John Kerry was here sitting in your seat, I asked him if he had read the verification deal between the IAEA and Iran, and he said no. He said he had been briefed on it. So it's hard to defend the verification regime to enforce the Iran nuclear deal. I don't know of a single member of Congress who has even seen it.
I can't speak to the details of that particular verification.
What about the sunset provisions that do exist? What do you recommend as far as a path forward if we were to be able to re-enter negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's the right question.
Excuse me, Mr. Brennan, can you pull the microphone a little closer, please?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
Great.
Is that better? It's exactly the right question, because ultimately, whether you supported this deal or opposed it, what we're trying to do here is accumulate pressure toward an end. Pressure is not the goal. The goal is a change in Iranian behavior. And the nuclear question is the single, as our allies told us, when Iran was 1 to 3 months away from a nuclear breakout, this is the single question that can take every other issue and turbocharge it and put a nuclear deterrent behind it or lead the United States into war. Now, I think it's going to be hard to re-enter this agreement because we're going to ask Iran to buy the same horse twice, essentially, to make concessions for things that we didn't deliver the last time. But I think it's going to be necessary to try to offer more to get more time, because you're right that we need more time, we need longer restrictions, and that may frankly require offering more in return. But I think that is what we need to do, because there aren't other choices. Eventually Iran will start to enrich again, absent an agreement, and we need a new and better deal.
And we're running a little short in time, and I want to hear from you with regards to, I mean, there are LGBT issues that we're seeing in the Middle East. We're reading about the new news today from Brunei. Congressman Cicilline and I have been involved in an effort with regards to Chechnya. It's all over the world. So I want to be able to speak about LGBT and the human rights. But I would just also offer there's been a lot of misinformation that's gone on all around the world as it relates to Iran's behavior, as it relates to IR-6s, IR-8s, access to military sites, acquiring heavy water, and more. But we only have a limited amount of time. Is there anything that you can add specifically, continuing the conversation that you had with Mr. Malinowski, about this? I mean, there's growing bipartisan concern here in Congress with regards to criminalizing in one of the worst ways the LGBT community around the world, and including Iran and elsewhere.
I think it's a terrific question, and I'm delighted that you asked it. I'm in the process of doing research on this topic with a group of graduate students at NYU. These are human rights. They should be part of human rights. When we talk about human rights anywhere, we should be talking about these issues as well. And we may disagree about marriage or other things, but we can all agree on stoning to death. We can all agree that somebody whose life is in danger for their orientation should be able to gain humanitarian parole. These are the kinds of things that we can and should work on, in some places quietly, because they create a backlash that can be disadvantageous to the people involved. But I think it's a bold and important area, and I'm delighted to see it gain bipartisan support and have a degree of policy continuity going forward, because I think it's part of the future of human rights.
Well, for lack of time, I'll have to yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This week marks the 6th month's anniversary since Jamil Khashoggi was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Our own intelligence community has indicated the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been responsible for the murder. We all can agree this is unacceptable. It goes against all notions of human rights and dignity. I've been disappointed by President Trump's response, which is basically no response. What should Congress be doing to ensure Saudi leadership doesn't take away the message that they're free to kill dissidents, use diplomatic cover to do so, and how do we send a clear message to the kingdom that we can't tolerate these actions? Let's start on the left and work our way across.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think what Congress has been doing to date is exactly what it needs to continue to do and more, keeping the spotlight on this despite the fact that the administration is less interested in talking about this in a full-throated way, particularly publicly, leaves this body with some of that work. And I think that this Congress needs to continue to demand the information that it demanded last week from Secretary Pompeo, which means full transparency with respect to the information that is available, and whatever continues to become available with respect to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I think this needs to be scrutinized. I think based on your judgments of that information, there could be discussion about an independent investigation that goes beyond what was started by the UN earlier this year. But I think keeping the conversation both publicly and, of course, privately, when members of Congress, as well as the administration, talks to the Saudi government about why this is so fundamentally against U.S. interests.
I agree. We need a full accounting. We need a full accounting and no impunity. And I think the clearest and most important message to send is that this kind of thing affects the entire nature of the partnership. This goes to basic questions of judgment. And I think that this, as part and parcel of other reckless moves that we've seen, require a broader review of all sorts of cooperation that we would engage in with an ally where we respected their judgment, but in this case might have to think twice about including offensive weaponry and nuclear cooperation and U.S. security and intelligence firms that have worked with Saudi as well.
You think we should discontinue those efforts?
No, I think we should take a careful look at each one and figure out which is appropriate and which is not. I think that with Saudi Arabia we have to be careful to both send a message of impunity and not tear down the relationship as a whole. But I think on offensive weaponry, there certainly are things that we should.
But if we coach the discussion regarding aimed at that one individual, not at the kingdom itself, but the individual that did this act that we're setting up to rule the kingdom for the next 50 years, wouldn't it be better to bite the bullet now?
It's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question, and I think we should follow the law where it takes us here in terms of a full and transparent accounting and whatever legal sanction exists there. And I think when it comes to somebody who may rule a country for 50 years, we should look for the possibility to get that country at least treated as a country and get that country to be incentivized to behave more responsibly. You've got your hands around the core of the dilemma, the crux of the dilemma, which is that singling out a person risks giving impunity, and singling out a person risks damaging a relationship for half a century. And I think we should follow the law, follow the Magnitsky Act, let the law go where it takes us, and demand a full investigation, no impunity.
Well, first, I'd like to welcome back everybody who I really, really missed during the Obama administration and your support for democracy and human freedom. Where were you? Second of all, Jamal Khashoggi didn't deserve to be murdered by anybody, but I want to really underscore the point that he is not the only person who has been murdered by his government, okay, that we have ignored for the last decade, whether it is our friends in Egypt, and you want to talk about LGBT rights. How much money do we give Egypt? We don't give any money to Saudi Arabia. What about our NATO ally, Turkey, that is so excited about this Jamal Khashoggi murder that they are leaking to us all of their intelligence about surveillance on the Saudi consulate, and yet it is the country with the most journalists in prison of any country in the world. Okay, the country that we just had to cut off F-35 purchases to because they're buying an S-400 air defense system from the Russians. What I'm trying to say is not that we should excuse the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or that we should not investigate it to its fullest. What I'm saying is if those are our standards, then let them be our standards about everything and everybody. You'll have my support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing to examine U.S. policy in what is truly a very important region of the world, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your insights. I think, like many members of this committee, I'm deeply concerned about the lack of clarity, the contradictions, and the dangerous decisions that have been offered as a substitute for cohesive policy toward the Middle East and North Africa by this administration. On issue after issue, we see a truly alarming lack of strategy or clear priorities. In Syria, we're leaving one minute, staying the next. The administration's unilateral actions vis-a-vis Israel have caused considerable concern regarding the prospect for peace and a two-state solution. In Saudi Arabia, the administration embraces a crown prince who is believed to have had a journalist hacked to death. In Yemen, the administration supports a military operation that furthers a conflict with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. In Iraq, millions of dollars in foreign assistance has been redirected from established aid institutions to instead fund religious organizations with little oversight or transparency. The administration unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal with no plan to stem Iran's nuclear ambitions. And so it goes on and on. Throughout the region, we see no coherent strategy or policy. It seems as if the administration lurches from one half-baked idea to the next with dire and sometimes deadly consequences. So I do think this is an opportunity for Congress and this committee in particular to hold the administration to account and to ensure that some coherent strategy is actually developed and implemented. So I'd first like to ask a broad question because there's been a lot of discussion about our values. And I'm just wondering whether the witnesses believe that this administration's de-emphasis of human rights, which I think most objective observers would say is a fact, that whether or not that has harmed our image in this region of the world, has it reduced our leverage? Because we all remain very concerned about it, what it means to Americans' leadership in the world and our ability to kind of exercise real influence in the Middle East. But I'm wondering whether your view is that this de-emphasis, which seems very clear and noticed by leaders around the world, whether that's in fact happening. And I'll start with you, if I may, Ms. Yours.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the de-emphasis has harmed our leverage to the extent that those partners who are perhaps quite content to not have it be part of the conversation, it's a freebie, right? It allows them to continue to take these actions, whether it be the arrests of journalists or of oppositionists, or actions more severe, like assassinations. The fact that this administration has not found it necessary, both privately and diplomatically, as well as publicly, to keep this as part of the discussion. It is not a zero sum. It is not the only issue we talk to partners about, but that it is not consistently raised suggests to these leaders that we don't care. And in fact, they can act with impunity. And so I think it has eroded leverage unnecessarily.
Mr. Brennan?
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. I think that this is something that they don't want to talk about, and sometimes they have convinced their publics not to trust us about. So I don't think it's as clear-cut as everywhere we go when we talk about this, publics cheer. There's nationalism in many of these countries. It's an underrated force at work in places like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and criticizing the government can lead to that kind of backlash. But I think what's important is that it gives governments pause in engaging in these kinds of activities to know that we just might show up and actually exercise our values. Now, the natural byproduct of mixing principle and prudence is inconsistency. It's what happens. It's part of balancing our various interests. But the fact that we care and the fact that we show up really does constrain behavior in ways that I think are meaningful. So I think it's less about our influence with populations than our leverage to work on things we care about. And ultimately, it's about the value of these partnerships and the ability of our partners to hold up as durable partners and not find ourselves in the kind of situation we do with Saudi Arabia, where their domestic repression makes them a less valuable partner for the things we need to do together.
And is that problem exacerbated when the President of the United States in fact describes a free press as enemies of the people, questions the legitimacy of election outcomes, attacks the rule of law in this country or the independence of the judiciary, or undermines law enforcement? It seems really difficult for the United States to be an effective, powerful advocate for democracy, rule of law, self-governance, frankly, when we have a President of the United States who is saying things which undermine those very institutions we're trying to promote. How can Congress respond to that in an effective way, if there is any way? Or am I just being overly sensitive?
I think you've described the problem admirably, and I think you have hopefully opportunities to vote on all sorts of matters pertaining to the promotion of and preservation of various democratic institutions and reform and vitalization of them in this country. And it's outside of my expertise that I've been brought to discuss before the committee, but I think it's all very deeply connected.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
Thank you. We've spent several hundred hours in this room, now maybe several thousand hours in this room, trying to discuss what policies would prevent Iran from getting its hands on a nuclear weapon. I'd like to discuss preventing Saudi Arabia from getting its hands on a nuclear weapon, because as I've said all too graphically and all too often, if you can't trust a regime with a bone saw, you shouldn't trust them with nuclear weapons. Now, the Emirates entered into a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States with all the controls. But they are going forward apparently with nuclear power. I don't know if this is within the expertise of any of our panelists. Are the Emiratis going forward with generating nuclear power, and does it make any economic sense given that they're on a peninsula that produces far more natural gas than it consumes, and therefore that natural gas is either flared or at great expense liquefied? So does it make sense, if you're on the Arabian Peninsula, to generate electricity with nuclear power the way the Emiratis say they're going to do? Anybody have an answer?
It depends what your attitude towards nuclear power is as an environmental issue. Certainly.
I've never... The Green New Deal is a major motivating factor in many places, probably not Dubai.
I haven't spoken to them about that.
So assume that, I mean, obviously there's some reputational plus for saying we're not emitting greenhouse gases. There's a minus for saying we're using nuclear power. Nobody ever got the Sierra Club Award by building a nuclear power plant. Assume that they're indifferent for their worldwide image and on the carbon issue.
I actually think it's a very interesting area of questioning, and I think it's an important area for Congress to pursue.
Okay. If there's anybody that can get us an answer for the record, that would be helpful, because I know these questions are coming out of left or right field. So now, one question that answers itself. Saudi Arabia could enter into a nuclear cooperation agreement with us with all the controls that the Emiratis agreed to. They are balking at that because they want the capacity to do more than generate electricity with nuclear power. Does this or inference or anything else cause you to think that the Saudis would like to have the capacity to move toward a nuclear weapon should they later make the decision to go forward? I'll start with, yeah.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll start with the end of that question and then add a couple of points. I'm not sure that I would infer directly that the desire to not adhere to the same kind of agreement that the UAE already has with the United States on civil nuclear energy is directly attributable to Saudi Arabia's desire to maintain the ability to develop a nuclear weapon at some point. I think it has as much to do with issues of sovereignty, certainly Saudi Arabia's desire to not telegraph that it gets a shorter deal than Iran. And so I think there are other considerations.
Well, I'd point out, the deal Iran gets is significant limits on its nuclear program and enemy status with the United States. They get both of that. So to say that, well, they get to have a few centrifuges, they get centrifuges, and if there's any sanction that we can put on them that we haven't legislated, yes, that should be our next markup.
Wholly concur, Congressman. But I think from the perspective of the Saudi government,
yeah,
there is this perception that if Iran has any indigenous enrichment capability, then the Saudis would not concede to giving that up just as a matter of practice. Now, I think when we come back to the discussion of a 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia, what we need to keep in mind is what is in the primary U.S. interest, and that is that agreement in various forms, and I am not an expert in this particular area, but I can say that we need to demand that commitment that abides by normative standards and international, and those
I see my time is and I do want to bring up one thing. The administration has issued 7 licenses under Part 810 to allow the transfer of nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, and Congress has not 1 millimeter of knowledge as to what's in it. That is a departure from not only practice but law. And I hope this committee joins with my committee, which is the Non-Proliferation Committee, among other things, in demanding that we get those Part 810 licenses. And it is simply absurd for the administration to say, yes, Congress has a role with regard to nuclear cooperation agreements, so we'll figure out a way to transfer nuclear technology to the Saudis without having such an agreement. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I thank the witnesses and all of the members for being here today. Witnesses, thanks for your testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you. We ask that you respond in writing to any of those questions. I request my colleagues, to my colleagues, that any witness questions be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days on a whole range of issues that we'll be touching on over the rest of this Congress, our alliances and security and democracy and terrorism and human rights and so many others. Thanks for helping to set the stage for what comes next. And with that, this committee is adjourned.